Hello and welcome to the Franz van Kat interview. I'm Annette Young. With violence escalating in Syria, the UN observer mission has been suspended. It's a major blow to the already fragile peace plan that was drafted by Special Envoy Kofi Annan. And once again, the choices for the international community as to what to do with Syria are no better than they were when the uprising began some 18 months ago. Joining me now from Cambridge in England is British military analyst Paul Smythe, who's been watching the situation unfold in Syria. Paul Smythe, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for asking me to be there.
The Syrian uprising has become one of the most deadliest conflicts resulting from the Arab Spring. The violence is spiralling. Where do you see things going from here?
Unfortunately, I think the situation, realistically speaking, is still quite bleak. First and foremost, above everything else, I think the priority of the international community must be to avoid making matters worse. Because although the violence hitherto has obviously been quite devastating for a number of people, it's still only a glimpse or a fraction of what could happen in Syria should we end up with a full-blown civil war along sectarian lines. So the main priority at the moment, as I say, is to avoid making matters worse.
Well, it certainly looks like it's becoming civil war. I mean, the United Nations, or rather senior officials in the United Nations have even declared it as such, haven't they, Paul?
It's very easy to get taken up with the amount of violence that we have, particularly nowadays with 24/7 media and obviously people able to blog from Syria itself or take mobile phone footage and so on. We're getting it delivered straight into our homes and workplaces, and that sort of maximises, if you like, the effect of the violence. But and this sounds very cruel, it's not meant to, but we're talking still at sort of 10 or 15,000 casualties, which is obviously awful. But when you compare that to the violence seen in Bosnia, in Rwanda and in Iraq after the occupation in 2003, where we've had hundreds of thousands of people either displaced or wounded or killed, we can see that the awful violence there has been in Syria thus far could still be much, much worse. And it's because of that, I think, that it's still perhaps premature to be talking about this in terms of civil war, because we haven't yet seen the extent in terms of geographical coverage or indeed the brutality and savagery that you would get with an all-out civil war.
Russia, however, is continuing to arm the Assad regime while Saudi Arabia and other Sunni nations are doing what they can to help the rebels. As more and more actors get involved from outside the country, it certainly has the capacity to become a regional conflict, doesn't it?
You're absolutely right, and I think that after the first priority of ensuring that you don't make matters worse, the next priority is to ensure that the international community keeps strategic priorities in view and just doesn't react to a sort of an emotional or sentimental reaction to the violence that we see each day. And those strategic priorities are at least three. One would be to secure regional stability. You're absolutely right that this could move across the border. We've already seen some tension in Beirut, in the Lebanon. We obviously wouldn't want to see this cause a spark that led to an Arab-Israeli crisis, and we certainly wouldn't want to see the nascent and growing democracy in Iraq put back by trouble in Syria. So the regional stability is incredibly important. Not wanting to see Syria governed by a militant Islamic government would also be a strategic objective. Obviously, there are immense problems with the current regime, but nobody would want to see a militant Islamic government which was aggressively anti-West, aggressively anti-Israeli, and sympathetic towards al-Qaeda. And then the third strategic priority would be to ensure that Syria's stocks of chemical weapons are secured, and that those do not either fall to a government, as I say, that's anti-West and anti-Israeli, but also that those chemical materials are not made available to sub-state actors like terrorist groups.
And certainly Israel has been making that very clear, that they are seriously considering plans of launching military strikes. against what they declare to be chemical weapons stockpiles. Do you think there's a serious likelihood of that actually happening?
I hope not, because if we actually look at it in the cold light of day, and it's very important to try and talk about Syria without being affected by the emotion of the violence, is that the surest way of keeping those weapons secure is the way they've been kept secure up to this point, which is that the Assad regime remains in place and keeps those secure. Unpalatable, but that's the reality.
Now, another actor in all of this, of course, is Iran, which has been weakened substantially by sanctions and oil prices starting to sink. Can you see them continuing to bolster Assad, given their precarious financial situation?
I must say I'm not an Iranian expert at all, but I would caution, and I've heard American politicians talk about this, sort of almost trying to act against Iran through Syria because of the closer relationship those two countries have. I think one of the problems with our dealing with the crisis in Syria is that the Assad regime is pretty isolated. And so who does it look to for advice? Who does it look to for counselling? It looks towards Tehran, it looks towards Moscow. And it would be far better, perhaps, if the regime was able to look further afield and look towards liberal states who have dealt with opposition amongst domestic populations without a resort to violence. I mean, the violence that we've seen in Syria, you could draw some parallels in a much smaller way with what had happened in Iran 2 years ago. And so we should be working, I think, to try and weaken and separate links between Tehran and Damascus, not force Assad closer towards allies we prefer that he didn't have.
Now, Syria, of course, is a completely different story to Libya, which is another example that's often touted as what to do in terms of international military intervention. I mean, the reality, given that it's a highly fragmented society, that the opposition is not at all united, the idea of military intervention is extremely unlikely, surely, at this point.
I think you're absolutely right. I go back to the first priority. Don't do anything that would make matters worse. There are talks, obviously, about having a no-fly zone. One of the problems with that, of course, is that much of the violence that we see on the ground in Syria is conducted by troops on the ground or by pro-regime militias, some using perhaps even knives and small arms. Well, there's nothing that air power can do to stop that sort of violence. So if Assad was to use more helicopters, there's some reports that he's been using helicopter gunships or indeed fixed-wing aircraft, then there may be a growing case to say let's have a no-fly zone. But there are immense differences between what happened in Libya and what is happening in Syria. It would be much, much more difficult to actually enforce a no-fly zone, to establish one in the first place, because the Syrian armed forces are more capable than the Libyans were. There are also many practical difficulties. I mean, for example, Aleppo and Damascus, let's say they're about 200 miles apart. So if you had a fighter patrolling over Damascus, what would be called a combat air patrol, it's about 20 minutes flying time to get to Aleppo if it was to detect, say, a helicopter flying there. So you need to have more than one combat air patrol. You have a series of caps. That increases the number of aircraft that are required. If you want to do that for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that increases the assets that are required, things like air-to-air refueling. And there are also practical difficulties in targeting helicopters. Helicopters obviously can be based in a field or in a car park. And so although against the Syrian Air Force you would be able to look at its airfields and make sure that jets didn't fly from those, it would be much more difficult to control the use of helicopters. And once one's airborne, if you were to then fly your fighter to try and do something about it, the helicopter, of course, can land. So there are lots of practical difficulties that shouldn't be neglected when it comes to something like a no-fly zone. And it would be a mistake, I think, to look at the Libyan example and to say, yes, there are direct parallels here. Let's think about the same thing in Syria.
So, Paul, if you don't go down the path of military intervention, what does that leave you? I mean, you've talked about using less coercion and more persuasion with Assad. Do you really think that's possible?
Well, I think the problem with the coercive approach is that coercion is a process, it's not a step. Use the analogy of, you twist somebody's arm, they don't do what you want them to do, so you twist it a bit harder. If they still resist, you have to twist it some more. It's a sort of a process, a competition of wills between the two. And if we look at the Assad regime and its determination to hold on to power, it has a far greater commitment to the crisis and its position than the international community has, particularly on the basis of experience in Iraq and the ongoing conflict in Afghanistan. The main military powers in the West have no appetite for another war in Syria. And so in terms of commitment, I think the competition between the Assad regime and the international community is stacked in Assad's favour, and therefore coercion is unlikely to work. And therefore we should be looking, and patently, evidently it hasn't worked hitherto, we should be looking at alternatives. And I think that there is still too much emphasis on the potential for a military intervention when we should be trying, above all, to get the parties to the conflict in Syria reliant on a political settlement, on the political dimension.
But Paul, isn't that too late in the day? I mean, we've already seen attempts, in terms of this a peace plan drafted by Kofi Annan. You've got both the Syrian opposition who's refusing to engage in talks with the government. I mean, how can that happen at this point in time?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. For example, in the Syrian National Council refusing to negotiate with Assad, we haven't yet tried to say to it, no, you must negotiate with Assad. The Syrian National Council has used the imagery of why would a victim negotiate with the torturer? Well, I think if you take that analogy, that's very much what it should do. There is such an imbalance in power between the torturer and the victim. If the only way of addressing that power imbalance is to talk, then that's what you should do. And I think that the Free Syrian Army has, in its strategic thinking, always has at the back of its mind the potential of a Western intervention. If it was made clear to the FSA that there was no chance at all of a military intervention from outside, then it would have to consider more carefully a political solution.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time. And that's it for this edition of the France 24 interview. Stay tuned for more news and headlines, which are coming up very shortly.